This is Duke University.
Jim Porter at UC Irvine. Jim works on Greek and Roman philosophy, literature and aesthetics, classical reception, and German intellectual history. He is the author of Nietzsche and the Philology of the Future, Stanford 2000, The Invention of Dionysus, an essay on the birth of tragedy, Stanford 2000, and The Origins of Aesthetic Thought in Ancient Greece, Matter, Sensation, and Experience, Cambridge University Press, 2010. His newest book, The Sublime in Antiquity, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press in 2014. And his paper today is called Auerbach's Dante.
Read from the contemporary present, Auerbach looks like a glamorous figure indeed. Until recently, it was fashionable to claim Auerbach as a founder of modern comparative literature. More recently, he's been celebrated as an exilic intellectual, a figure of secular criticism, and as a prophet of global literary studies or world literature. Read from the perspective of his own lifetime, Auerbach presents a much less flashy CV. He was in the first instance a Romance philologist who trawled through medieval and modern literary texts and authors, chiefly in Latin, French, or Italian, some of them well-known, others more or less obscure. He was a master of relentlessly close and demanding explication du texte. In addition, he was a student of the Christian Church and its intricate theological and philosophical debates, which he pursued in a lifelong engagement with the Christian traditions of the West, most obviously in his various studies on Dante and in his essay Figura. But not only there. So deep was his knowledge in this area that he was accustomed to receiving requests from Catholic prelates for his opinion on finer points of church dogma while he was at Yale, requests that he invariably met with a knowing smile. We are thus faced with two very different images of Auerbach, the romanticized prophet of contemporary theory and the formidably erudite Romance philologist. Which of these is correct? Neither, in fact. But in order to see why, we must first deal with one of the most difficult puzzles in Auerbach's career, namely his intense and abiding interest in Christianity. Now, I should mention that the title has a subtitle now, or in parentheses. In parentheses, understand, in the light of mimesis for this paper, and you'll see why. I say puzzle, and it is one, not only for someone who believes, as I do, that Auerbach was a self-confessed, if non-observant Jew, and he practiced what might be called a Jewish, or if someone insists, a Jewish philology, in the guise of Romance philology, and ultimately a kind of Jewish-inflected intellectual and spiritual history of the Western world, from Homer in the Old Testament to his contemporary present. The image of Auerbach is obsessively concerned with Christian motifs, beliefs, and attitudes is hard to square with his identity as a Jew. To put the matter bluntly, what business did he have studying the Catholic Church? The puzzle is best explained if we set out to enlarge rather than narrow our view of Auerbach's intellectual projects. Let me try to restate these briefly. A consummate student of the literary and cultural inheritances of the West in their comprehensive totality, what Auerbach is striving to capture throughout all of his writings is nothing less than the evolution of historical consciousness as it moves out of a universe filled with myths into one that is saturated with history. The evolution is one he applauds, not least because it leads to the difficult discovery of the sensuous, the earthly, and the human and social worlds. Christianity has a significant, though not quite central, Auerbach would say underrated, place in this narrative. Intimately connected with this evolution is the emergence of the modern subject and the changing history of its passions. In tracing this emergence, Auerbach is at the same time tracing something like the historical grounding of autonomous, in Vico's sense, man-made ethical consciousness and human agency. Because his emergence of passionate subjects is a tumultuous one, much of the time Auerbach is charting the contortions, the psychopathology of the Western soul. You can all hear me okay, right? Finally, towards the end of his life, Auerbach redubbed his inquiry Weltphilologie. The name changes nothing, though it does put his project's largest contours into sharper relief. Weltphilologie is a philology of the radically human world. Because Auerbach considers history to be secular, at least tendentially, vital and concrete, as human and humane, his philology is in the end an earthly, this worldly philology, a philology not of the word, but of the world, the human world, that is, as this is represented, experienced, and lived, dargestellte Wirklichkeit, which is from the title of his famous book. It is a world that is in fact to be loved. Each of these points runs through the ambitious literary history that Auerbach pieces together in his lifetime, starting with the Old Testament and culminating in Dante's Divine Comedy, although Auerbach, as it were, reverse engineers this history, since he only arrives at the Old Testament reading in its fullest form in 1942, while he was teaching in Istanbul, having described the decisive turning point in his masterpiece on Dante in 1929, while he was still a postdoctoral student in Berlin. As we shall see, the order of events here makes no difference to Auerbach's theory, because the underlying model is consistently in place from start to finish. To anticipate my reading today, Auerbach locates the origins of historical consciousness where one least expects to find it, not in modernity, when religion finally relaxed its grip on the West, but in the Old Testament itself, where history was first invented or discovered, and which then provided the structure and framework for all subsequent expressions of historical thought and experience from early Christianity onward. So now we begin with mimesis. The opening chapter of this work, Auerbach's single and most familiar piece of writing, is based on a provocative contrast between Homer and the Old Testament. His argument, quickly sketched, is that the Old Testament presents reality in the form of a gap or abyss that rips through space and time thanks to the plunging intervention of God's purpose from above, which renders these two outer dimensions of human existence utterly insignificant. But there is a catch, for while reality so conceived transcends and thus drains history of all significance, the ideology, Auerbach calls it the Jews' Auffassungs- und Darstellungsweise, that frames and supports this grasp of reality is itself decidedly historical, both in the unbounded claims it makes on world history, Weltgeschichte, and in the impression that the biblical stories ultimately make on the reader, which is historical. Consequently, I quote, number one, the concept of God held by the Jews is less a cause than a symptom of their manner of comprehending and representing things. The example of the binding of Isaac episode is introduced as a case in point, though there are others. Abraham's journey to Moriah is bereft of spatial and temporal coordinates twice over. First, as Auerbach puts it in a highly poetic and suggestive paraphrase, which is text number 2, the journey is like a silent progress through the indeterminate and the contingent, a holding of the breath, a process which has no present, which is inserted like a blank duration between what has passed and what lies ahead. Secondly, Moriah exists nowhere except textually. The word, Auerbach speculates, was introduced into the text by a later redactor in order to put a name on a place that he either did not know or else was not given in the original. Whether or not Auerbach is correct, and current views work against that hypothesis, which was fashionable at the time, the direction of his reading is clear. Drained of all contours and all meaning, more enigmatic than real, and, quote, indefinite and in need of interpretation, time and space in the Old Testament exist for one purpose only. They serve as a staging point for endlessly receding layers of meaning, God's purpose, which remains obscure to the end. Indeed, they provoke this search. Later Christian figural reading responds to the same need, but at the cost of overwhelming and finally dissolving the Old Testament's claims on reality. So that's what text 3 and A and B are about. And he's already discussing figura there, already looking back to the essay. Paradoxically, in their superficial meaningless, their inconsequentiality, and their virtual emptiness, God and his events display Gestaltlosigkeit, Ortlosigkeit, and Einsamkeit. Time and space create in the minds of the faithful a powerful sense of time, fate, and consciousness. Not only in the sense that their featurelessness gives rise to a desire to anchor events in historical reality, as in the case of Moriah, where this desire verges on compulsivity, but also because every individual moment in each person, from Adam to the prophets, embodies, renders palpably concrete and particular, the vertical relationship to God. God, he writes, chose these and formed these men to the end of embodying his essence and will. And yet, the revelation of that essence and that will is not immediate. It only comes to light over time. Consequently, Auerbach writes, number 4, choice and formation do not coincide, for the latter proceeds gradually, historically, during the earthly life of him upon whom the choice has fallen. So it happens that time, originally evacuated of meaning, transforms into its opposite. It becomes rich, significant, laden with purpose, scattered clues. It thickens with layers of inevitable meaning. It deepens. Time becomes historical. And the same holds to a lesser extent for space. As these regain their original properties, so to speak, now in a heightened form, they acquire a palpable sensuousness. He calls this Sinnlichkeit, that can be felt in the narratives that relate events and in the events themselves, the quote-unquote, the sensible material of life, he calls it. Grounded in an attentiveness to what does not coincide, aware of differences, of a meaning that reveals itself over time, and in this sense maybe dialectical in the sense that Hanan was talking about yesterday. For example, in the distinctive biographies of evolving, incomparably unique individuals. Auerbach calls this the intensity of a personal history that a reader feels, and for these reasons, these same reasons, fraught with doubt and uncertainty, this heightened form of perception discovers meaning in the inner complexity and layered quality of events. It is also preeminently historical, for history in Auerbach's eyes is the symptomatic record of writhing contradictions, as well as the slow and painful awareness of this fact. To be aware of an event in time is to become aware of a reality that cannot be grasped intellectually, but only passionately in the very desire to grasp it and hold on to it. It is to experience, to be visited by a fundamental discrepancy between signs and meanings, and thus to experience reality in and as tension. Spannung. But isn't this tension constituted only in relation to a meaning that descends from above? Yes, but not exactly, because divine truth remains forever concealed, lurking inaccessibly in the surface of human reality, which henceforth acquires a verticality all of its own. Owing to this elusive concealment, interpretation is both required and demanded, but also never fully rewarded. It remains precisely an endless endeavor, as uncertain and contingent as genuine historical reality itself, die echte Geschichte. Of course, you might say, historical contingency exists in the Old Testament simply because of God's inscrutable purpose, which can intrude on earthly life at any time. In fact, Auerbach's point is the reverse. God's purpose is merely the Jew's way of discovering the rich, if painful, contingency of historical time. The definition of historical is undergoing extraordinary pressure in Auerbach's hands. History for Auerbach is not something given. Rather, it has to be teased out of circumstances as their evolved and significant product. To deduce history from events in this way is to develop an awareness that can only be located in the kinds of difficult antagonism that are brought to light in the Bible. And to do all this is to embark on the road towards historical consciousness in the West, the very sense of history that we currently know. There ought to be nothing terribly controversial about any of this. After all, the text under inspection by Auerbach is not a mirror of reality. It is the recreation of a reality produced not by prophets and priests, but by scholars and editors. He names the Elohist as the author of the Abraham and Isaac episodes, the Javis for other episodes, and other redactors who've come after them. And these redactors were not poets who created legends. They were writers of history whose notion of the structure of human life was schooled in history. I don't know if that's up or not. No, maybe not. That was a quote. The correction of Moriah is a case in point. Divinity serves as a catalyst to sense-making, but not as its telos. God, after all, is a symptom of the Jewish way of grasping reality. And for the same, we might say, likewise, Vishian reasons, historical experience is for Auerbach anchored in the experience of conflict and antagonism. It is here that it touches the real. For, and here's text 5, it is precisely the most extreme circumstances in which we are immeasurably forsaken and in despair, or immeasurably joyous and exalted, that give us, if we survive them, a personal stamp which is recognized as the product of a rich existence, a rich development, end of quote. And that gives such events a historical character. The sudden intrusion of the personal voice here, we, points to Auerbach's own present circumstances, but also to his own cherished beliefs. With this, Auerbach has grazed the core of his theory of mimesis as the representation of reality, what he generally calls tragic realism. Tragic realism is Auerbach's way of naming the troubling juncture between the surfaces of life and language, which one can both know and feel, and the plunging vertical aspect of some other dimension altogether, which one can only sense. It is at such moments that mimesis is achieved, the representation of the essential unity of a character with its fate in all their blinding reality and luminous evidence, as revealed in a singular act of self. Anticipating Foucault by half a century, Auerbach calls such moments problematizations of the ordinary, though what he is designating is in fact the substratum of reality that underlies all ordinary experience. Auerbach also knows, however, that much of the time such abrupt communications with the real do not occur at all. We live in reality, but rarely commune with it. And that is most likely why, when such moments do occur, they warrant the name tragic, for they signal their own self-consuming fragility and their own passing. Such moments may be rare, but they are also indelible. Their occurrence is marked in literature by a radical convergence of high and low styles. He calls this Stilmischung, the mixture of styles, which is not simply the formal rupture of the classical separation of styles, Stiltrennung, into high, middle, and low, but the shattering of style as a meaningful criterion of anything at all. Sublimity is unearthed in the depths that suddenly open up in the realm of the everyday, as the expressions of a passionate subject who is firmly located in space and time here on earth. There are some echoes with Buber's essay on interpreting Hasidism. I think that that's probably not, and you will soon, it's not a surprise. Buber, this now explains to me, having read the essay yesterday after the talk, this does account for why Buber was so keen on having Auerbach's mimesis translated into Hebrew and made that happen. I think he saw it as a confirmation of his own theory of lived experience. There are also very great differences as well. Auerbach's account of the historical realism of the Bible is premised on this very same idea. The individuals narrated in the Old Testament take on the concrete features of personality they have, precisely because, text 6, they are bearers of the divine will, and yet they are fallible, subject to misfortune and humiliation, and in the midst of misfortune and in their humiliation, their acts and words reveal the transcendent majesty or sublimity of God. Humiliation and elevation go far deeper and higher than in Homer, and they belong basically together. Humiliation, or lowering, and elevation, or raising up, belong together because they obey the principle of Stilmischung, or the confounding of stylistic categories, in the course of an overwhelming confrontation with historical reality. History does indeed hurt. We should be aware of reducing Auerbach's biblical analysis to a simple analysis of style. His theory of style is quite the contrary, a theory of reality as experienced. And it is the Old Testament and not the Christian Gospels, as is widely believed, that marks the foundational moment in the discovery of these features of reality, which will re-exhibit themselves in all subsequent literary history and in all subsequent communications with the historical, significant, and ethical real, including, above all, in the Christian traditions of the West, where these processes gather momentum. Demonstrating all of this was the motive behind Auerbach's study, Dante as poet of the earthly world, to which we may now turn. The work's title tells us everything we need to know about this early work by Auerbach. Its thesis and main provocation is that Christianity, in fact, intensified the sensibility for and attachment to earthly existence, a fact that its core myth, this is Auerbach's term, both advertises and embodies symptomatically. Hence the tragic realism that is distinctive of Dante's poem, and that also mirrors the tragic realism of the Christian faith, but which also reflects its historical core, which turns on two main elements for Auerbach. One, Christ's incarnation, the appearance of Christ as a concrete event, as a central fact of world history, in his words. And two, his passion, the suffering that the event produces. Auerbach is distilling a mixture of inherited views. To the problem of the historicity of Christ treated by Auerbach's teacher, Ernst Troeltsch, Auerbach adds the crucial twist of existential agony. Christianity, for Auerbach, is essentially defined by traits, not by chance, already familiar: doubts, dissonance, torment, constant restlessness, irresolvable tension, Spannung, and despair. Even, he writes, Christ himself lived in continuous conflict, Spannung. Christianity shows itself to be the incarnation less of spirit than of conflicting aspirations. These aspirations and passions are fully on display in the individual biographies that make up the substance of the Divine Comedy, each endowed with as much concrete reality, development, and historicity as any individual from the Old Testament. They are thickly described. As in the Old Testament personalities, so too here, their characters and actions reveal their fates. The conflicts and even reality remain, however, structurally the same. But Dante's naturalism renders the dilemmas all the more wrenching, rooted as they are in the sensuous particular of each given human reality. The result is an intensification, not a transcendence, of the original dilemmas of the Old Testament. After all, uncertainty or insecurity in the earthly world, he writes, is a Christian motif. The focus in Dante falls entirely on, and this is text 7, the narrow cleft of earthly human history, the span of man's life on earth, in which the great and dramatic decision of a person's destiny must fall. The cleft is truly open, the span of light is short, uncertain, and decisive for all eternity. It is the magnificent and terrible gift of potential freedom which creates the urgent, restless, no less human than Christian European atmosphere of the irretrievable, fleeting moment that must be made the most of. Dante's achievement was to capture this unsettled frame of mind through the compelling mimetic character that he gave to his souls. But this amounts to more than a triumph of mimetic realism in a narrow literary sense. Dante's naturalism wrests from the afterlife the vitality of living creatures conditioned by time and presents them in all their contingent and particular glory, as he says. Auerbach dubs them for this reason Zeitmenschen, creatures of time. He is insisting, along with Dante, that temporal beings are to be found in the eternal afterlife, and that this temporality captures an essential aspect of their being. In this way, Dante made two significant innovations over his predecessors, and these were linked. He discovered the individual living person, while simultaneously placing him in the realm of history, which, he writes, is his true home. And Dante achieved a novel vision of reality. In contrast to the asceticizing view of contemporary Dantists like Karl Fossler, Dante's vision was for Auerbach an agent of profound cultural change. The logic of his poetry led not to an embrace of transcendence, but to something new, an unprecedented sense of historical immediacy and a rich capacity for grasping human experience in its most vital, if vulnerable, aspects. As a result, Dante was realizing a potential within the Christian theological worldview that led to the dissolution of that worldview altogether. In Dante, the indestructibility of the whole historical and individual man, that's 8, turns against the divine order and obscures it. The image of man eclipses the image of God. Dante's work realized the Christian figural essence of man and destroyed it in the very process of realizing it. So Auerbach in Mimesis, reiterating a claim from his Dante book, where we read how in Dante and his aftermath, this is 8, sorry. No, I've got it wrong. Maybe it's 9. Maybe you should go to 9. Well, maybe it's not there at all. History as such, the life of the human being, as this is given, and in its earthly character, underwent a vitalization and required a new value. Okay, that wasn't worth putting up. Almost immediately, the historical realm, it is worth putting up, the historical realm becomes a fully earthly and autonomous entity, and from there the fecundating stream of sensuous and historical evidence spills forth over Europe, to all appearances utterly removed from its eschatological origins. I guess I merged it with 8. and yet secretly connected to these by the bonds that hold man fast to his concrete and historical destiny. Contemporary viewers like Fossler objected to this radical reading by the young Auerbach for all the right reasons. On the one hand, Auerbach was using Dante to illustrate the inexorable movement of history towards secular humanism, a movement whose seeds he located in the very devotional poetry of Dante himself. On the other hand, he was painting a rather unflattering portrait of the Christian, anxiety-ridden mind. Lastly, he was underscoring how Christ's messianic project crucially failed. In Auerbach's words, Christianity was a movement which, by its very nature, could not remain fully spiritual and was never fully actualized in the world. All that was a lamentable failure, a point that is reinforced in Mimesis, where we read, "Such attempts were bound to falter." This was the essence of the tragic realism of the Christian faith. De-Christianization, Entchristung, was endemic to Christianity from its beginnings. And yet it was by means of this very paradox that Christianity helped to propel the world forward into time and history through incarnation, passion, the sense of the real. Christianity thereby, or the earthly real, I should say, Christianity thereby served as a gradually vanishing mediator that created the conditions for its own suppression and withering away. Dante is the vivid proof of these claims. And yet, if Christianity vanished, the structures that brought it into being did not. These remain in place, even in our secular world today, in the form of the problems of meaning, action, and the ethics of the real. These are the secret conditions that he mentions at the end of that quote that hold man fast to his concrete and historical destiny. In naming these connections, Auerbach is not suggesting anything like a secret theology of worldly philology, or any sort of providential eschatology, as some critics today would have it. Quite the contrary, he is pointing to the fact that human history, to the extent that it is meaningful at all, is to be sought in the very depths of the worldly surfaces of life, the everyday depths and total inner structure, he says, of history, as he writes in a later chapter of Mimesis. But then none of this is new. It was all legible in the Jewish Old Testament. And so, in pleading for a humane and humanistic ethical and historical consciousness, Auerbach does not so much reverse the devaluation of Judaism through Christianity as he illustrates the inevitable failure of that project. For all historical thought is at its origins Jewish, which is what makes Auerbach a uniquely significant Jewish intellectual and a modern for critical and engaged thinking today. Thank you.
Thanking Shai and Jonathan. It's been a real pleasure to be here. It's an incredibly exciting event. And I want to thank Janice, too, for all your help for making everything run so smoothly. So for my paper, what I did was reinterpret the title of the conference a little bit to think not so much about Jews and the ends of theory, but actually theory and the ends of Jewish identification. In particular, the practices of Jacques Derrida to think Jewishness in ways that transcend a covenantal model and its concomitant communitarianism. Here I want to think about the role of literature as a modern institution and the role that it plays in relation to both philosophical and religious registers in discourse. This paper is thus the beginning of the project that Jonathan mentioned. The sun is a parasite as literature. Derrida writes this in a 1999 essay, Literature in Secret. Within the context of the essay, the statement is a commentary on Kafka's letter to his father, which is itself treated in the essay as a commentary on the story of Abraham and Isaac. However, surreptitiously, there's another father-son narrative that resonates in this text, and throughout Derrida's late corpus, the story of another betrayal between father and son, one which situates Derrida as the son and the parasite, as the site of literature even, and Emmanuel Levinas as the father. It's my contention in my talk today that to understand Derrida's relation to Judaism, to the figure of the Jewish intellectual, his relation to Emmanuel Levinas is a key link, and that in fact the above comment can be read as a gloss on that relation. The essay in which this comment appears, Literature in Secret, was added as an addendum in 1999 to Gift of Death, and while Levinas plays a fairly central role in Gift of Death, his name appears in Literature in Secret only in the context of an anecdote. And the anecdote only calls attention to itself insofar as Derrida over-signifies his efforts not to draw attention to it. It appears within brackets and is prefaced with a disclaimer. This is the anecdote. Although reporting this anecdote is not essential to what I'm developing here, I remember how one day Levinas, in an aside, during a dissertation defense, said to me, with a sort of sad humor and ironic protestation, "Nowadays, when one says God, one almost has to ask for forgiveness or excuse oneself. God, if you'll pardon the expression." It'd be easy to dismiss the comment. Derrida has himself already redoubled his indication that this is exactly what we should do. After all, what would Levinas have to do with an essay whose primary theme is the relation between scripture and literature? The answer, of course, is everything. Derrida, if we look closely, has in fact already given himself away. For the phrase, God, if you'll pardon the expression, appears as the essay's epigram, under the title and after the subtitle, An Impossible Filiation. As an epigram, it appears without quotes, disconnected from its context, an unattributed citation, a fragment. The essay Literature in Secret itself concerns the process by which a word spoken between two can become quotation, citation, and then fragment. It considers what happens when a pledge or a secret is subject to representation. It argues that representation is always already a dissimulation and a betrayal of this relation. Explicitly at issue is the secret that stands between Abraham and Isaac in the Akedah. And the essay proposes that the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac in the Hebrew Bible is already a betrayal of the pact between Abraham and God, as a recounting of what Abraham could not himself tell, what he could not tell Sarah or Isaac. It's the recounting of this story by a third party, disseminated to anyone, for any reader. For Derrida, this drift from covenant to narrative from the second to the third person reveals the connection between modern fiction and the story of Abraham. Modern fiction, Derrida argues, is the inheritor of a biblical betrayal. Moreover, it is something like a sequel, a repetition and reorientation of the religious fable. What separates it from the biblical testament is that it signifies as a request for pardon, a pardon for the betrayal of representation. By treating what it represents as fiction, literature refuses to offer up the secret as something revealed. Pardon de ne pas vouloir dire, or pardon for not meaning to say, this fragment, according to Derrida, is the formula at the heart of modern literature. Fiction, in particular, is marked by the suspension of vouloir dire insofar as it disrupts any transparent relation between what is represented and reality. A fictional story recounts. It moves the relation between two to the plane of representation, where it becomes a relationship for a third. In this sense, it inherits the biblical task of revealing the secret, but it alters it by presenting its material under new auspices. The circulation of literature opens up the relation between two to anyone who can pick up and read, but it replaces the covenantal call with content whose status has itself been called into question by the fact of its context itself having been disrupted. What is key in Literature in Secret is that this kind of repetition, whose function is to undermine the dynamic of election without covering over its own problematic status as representation. At the same time, Derrida argues, literature reinstates the secret, but on new ground, not as the site of a covenantal election, a between two which can in fact be betrayed, but rather through an exposure to interpretation and resignification, to a slippage in meaning that ironically guards its own secret by disrupting the relation between agent and meaning, such that a vertical relation of revelation is replaced by a horizontal drift. One could argue, of course, as Derrida often does, that this quality is not particular to literature, but it's in fact intrinsic to language itself. Thus, what marks literature is its avowed parasitic position. It sucks the life out of the covenantal structure of the biblical testament, but feeds off of its contractual ties. Derrida begins the essay by asking us to imagine the phrase pardon for not meaning to say divorced from any context, discovered on a wall or inscribed in a stone, such that the average hermeneut would never know whether this request ever signified something in a real context. So with this context of the essay in mind itself, let's return to the anecdote with which I began. In retelling the story about Levinas, Derrida is himself betraying his own pact. The story is told of a moment when Levinas took Derrida into confidence. The act of its recounting not only betrays this confidence, it also reveals something of the transformative quality of representation. What we have here is a redoubled irony, for Levinas, who is himself being ironic, appears to have made the comment in a shared moment of intimacy with Derrida, in which Derrida, as addressee, would appear to have been in collusion with Levinas. The irony of Levinas's comment has the function of solidifying an unspoken agreement between two. They share a smile and a sense of incredulity that reference to the divine, to the sphere of religion, would be something for which one would have to excuse oneself. Wayne Booth calls this stable irony, in which understanding the meaning of the utterance implies the confidence that both the speaker and the listener know the speaker's position and get the joke. This mode of irony, Booth notes, quote, is the key to the tightest bonds of friendship. For it marks, let me add to Booth, the sight of a secret. As I'll show in more details in a moment, this is a consistent rhetorical technique employed by Levinas in his essays, one that seems to have the function of drawing the line between insider and outsider, friend and enemy, Jew and pagan. In the act of retelling the story, Derrida has betrayed the secret, as well as the bond enforced by the rhetorical technique. This is even more apparent when we consider the context. The incident itself is relayed in the service of an argument claiming literature as that which, in naming God, must ask forgiveness. The dynamic that Levinas seems to be condemning, Derrida is defending as the fundamental task of literature. Thus, in telling the story, Derrida has broken the pact set in place by the original ironic utterance. He's resisted the gesture of inscription, which would place Derrida and Levinas on the inside of an understanding, only by excluding the others present. In the process, he's at least momentarily established a new site of stable irony between Derrida and the reader or listener to Derrida's paper, such that Levinas would now be excluded and indeed would become the object of the joke. But of course, for Derrida, no irony can ever remain stable. Thus, the betrayal is not the final act here. In fact, Derrida uses Levinas's words to perform the function he ascribes to literature. For in using the phrase as an epigram, Dieu, passez-moi l'expression, Derrida has set in motion the representational drift. So far as the essay defines literature as Scripture's bastard son, betraying its secret but reinscribing it through a slippage that disallows disclosure, Derrida has turned his own covenantal secret into literature. The incident itself provides the formula for understanding Derrida's relation to Judaism, in contrast to Levinas's. Neither is a stranger to irony, but for Levinas, irony is a tool for developing communal cohesion and emphasizing mutual understanding. For Derrida, it is the device by which one slips out of the community's grip. Given Derrida's rhetorical manipulation of his Jewish identity, the references he makes to himself as Reb Risa and Reb Rita in Writing Indifference, his calling himself the last Jew in Circumfession, and a Morano in many of his later texts, the topic itself is probably best broached through an analysis of his text. Neither of these books put much stock in the Jewish interpretation of Derrida's thoughts. The very reconstruction of his attachment and detachment from his Jewish upbringing has once again become a topic of some discussion, most recently in Sam Moyn's review of these biographical works for the Jewish Review of Books. Here, I too will briefly dwell on the biographical details, only to give more context to the textual connections Derrida makes in his own work between his relation to Judaism and his relation to Emmanuel Levinas. The two thinkers, Derrida and Levinas, share in common that they both come to France from Jewish backgrounds, Levinas Ashkenazic, Derrida Sephardic, and that for each philosophy, the philosophical canon was the means by which they acclimated and assimilated into French culture. For both, France and its philosophical culture was a means of liberation. For Derrida, from the moment of his expulsion from the state-run Lycée Ben Apnin in November 1942 and his enrollment at the Lycée Maïmonide, Judaism was associated with the procedures of communal inscription. From Derrida's perspective, the act of anti-Semitism was mirrored in the reformulation of the Jewish community in its response to Vichy race laws. Quote, "This reactive self-defense was certainly natural and legitimate, even irreproachable," he once said, "but I must have sensed that it was a drive, a gregarious compulsion that responded too symmetrically, that corresponded in truth to an expulsion." Even after Derrida was allowed to return to the Lycée, the experience tainted his passion for school, and it was only the discovery of a vocation in philosophy that provided the avenue of transformation and transportation to an affiliation with the metropole. But Jewishness could not fully be sloughed off for Derrida, even by changing continents. From the very first, it shadowed his relation to Levinas. While Derrida and Levinas first met in 1964 in Levinas's class at the Sorbonne, Benoit Peters notes that Levinas could have come to know him through other means, through the network of the Jewish community. Jacques Lazarus, the Algerian representative to the World Jewish Congress, which sponsored the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs de langue française, of which Levinas was one of the founding members and most important contributors, wrote to Derrida's father, Aimé Derrida, just a few months after Derrida had begun attending Levinas's class. He wrote to tell him that he had told Professor Levinas about Aimé's son Jacques and Jacques' work on Husserl. Levinas replied to Lazarus that he would be very happy to be in touch with Derrida. Levinas's position, thus as surrogate father, was secured. It is clear as well that Derrida had at least some affiliation himself with the colloque. He's listed among the invited participants throughout the 1960s, and at least twice in these years as one of the attendees in 1964 and 1969. It's not until 1998, however, 2.5 years after Levinas's death, that Derrida spoke at the colloque, and there addressed Levinas's role in his previous attendance. He notes in his talk that Marie-Anne Lescorre had written in her biography of Levinas, quote, "But among the French philosophers of Jewish origin, one will never see Jacques Derrida there." According to Derrida himself in 1998, it was just the once that he'd previously attended in 1965. The record suggests it was actually 1964 as a silent participant. He then, quote, he then says about Emmanuel Levinas, "I was there close to Emmanuel Levinas, near him, perhaps together with him. In truth, I was here thanks to him, turned toward him. That is still the case today, differently." These words he speaks now for the first time at the colloque, but he never refers to himself as an intellectuel juif de langue française, except to note that this is exactly what his listeners would call him. The act of community inscription that is only intimated in the anecdote previously described, an act which is performed in and through irony, is here more directly referenced. It seems, at least from Derrida's description, that he was at the colloque with Levinas and because of him. Derrida is thus informing the present-day audience of the role that Levinas played as his intermediary. Levinas is thus the link between Derrida and the figure of the Jewish intellectual. Derrida frames his appearance at the meeting in terms of his ambivalence towards community inscription, titling the talk "Avowing the Impossible, Returns, Repentance, and Reconciliation." The sense in which Derrida's presence at the colloque in 1998, just a few years after Levinas's death, amounts to an avowal, a confession of identity, a return to the fold, is referenced here and in the talk, without ever being a direct subject of discourse. It's striking, then, that in asserting his link to Levinas, Derrida reports the story of another aside spoken by Levinas to Derrida, another moment of Levinasian irony, and once again Derrida enacts another betrayal. "I recall what Levinas told me in an aside," he again begins. And this time, rather than minimizing the incident's importance, he calls attention to it. He specifies that he will recount the incident in the present tense, in the style of the historian who uses the present to make his words more sensible to representation. Derrida's own irony here is palpable, as it is exactly the possibility of such coincidence between speaker and listener that he aims to call into question. He continues, "André Neher is lecturing, and Levinas whispers in my ear, 'You see, he is the Protestant, me, I'm the Catholic.' This time, Derrida's audience is the colloque itself, the audience from which this aside was actually kept secret. Recounting the moment is once again an act of betrayal, to be sure. Once again, Derrida notes Levinas's irony and asks, what must a Jewish thinker be in order to use this language with the depth of seriousness and the lightness of irony we hear in it? This is a strange question. What must a Jewish thinker be? Derrida seems to be asking it under the assumption that the anecdote once again marks a moment of stable irony, a moment in which Levinas is able to call himself a Catholic without calling into question Derrida's own capacity to share in the joke. But of course, Derrida will not let such an assumption of complicity remain. A further betrayal. Derrida asks, how can he remain a Jew together with himself, while opening himself to another, probable or improbable Jew, in this case me, who has never felt very Catholic, and above all not Protestant, a Jew who comes from another shore of Judaism than Neher and Levinas, a Mediterranean shore, immediately immediately remarks in the abyss of these doubles or of this Judeo-Catholic Protestant triangle the absence of the Islamo-Abrahamic. Levinas's joke refers, I'm assuming, to the fact that Neher at these meetings gave the biblical interpretation and Levinas the Talmudic. Thus, Neher felt the biblical text could be read without an interpretive apparatus, where Levinas insisted that within the Jewish tradition, the Torah could only be read and interpreted through the rabbis. Derrida, thus, by way of this comment, situates himself apart from both of these perspectives, denying vehemently the Protestant claim to textual transparency. At the same time, he construes the joke otherwise, for the second time, for he has already told the story of the incident in his eulogy for Levinas, where he used it to point to the warm reception Levinas received among Catholics. Here, in avowing, he uses the incident instead to suggest that the fact of such hybridization, Jewish Catholic, Jewish Protestant, ought to destabilize the very conditions for such a context of understanding. Derrida asks, how could such a split or divided Jew, referring ostensibly to himself in the third person, but also to Levinas, I think, have received this remark? How could he welcome its letter according to the spirit, that nothing of all these differences, dissociations, or indecisions could cut into the complicity of a certain living together? Derrida here calls into question more directly the very procedure of stable irony on which Levinas depends, particularly in his Jewish writing. He calls it into question the assumption that there could be a contemporaneity between two people, and furthermore that one could ever be contemporaneous with oneself. According to Derrida, the covenantal relation, the oath, and the secret are all already compromised the moment one opens one's mouth to speak or to respond to a call. This point has important consequences concerning what it means to call oneself Jewish, insofar as Judaism serves as the exemplary covenant for Derrida. As I mentioned above, irony appears consistently in Levinas's Jewish writings, often through rhetorical questions in which Levinas parrots a derogatory depiction of Judaism in order to afterwards debunk it. Or he parodies a position he finds pedestrian or indulgent only to demand more of his listener or reader. For example, in the essay, The State of Israel and the Religion of Israel, published in Evidence, a post-war French Jewish journal, Levinas begins, the idea that Israel has a religious privilege is one that exasperates everyone. Some see it as unjustified pride, while to others it looks like an intolerable mystification, which in the name of a sublime destiny robs us of earthly joys. To live like every other people on earth with police and cinemas and cafes and newspapers. What glorious destiny. He concludes with an exclamation point, the ultimate signifier of sarcasm. The point here, as elsewhere, is to use irony or sarcasm to undermine the perspective that he wants to discredit. This technique has the effect, on the one hand, of catching the reader sympathizing with the zeitgeist, but then of reinscribing her into the circle, so that after having been corrected, she can inhabit as well the ironic voice that distances her from popular opinion. The Jewish perspective thus serves as an interruption and an agitation to the common culture, but is only effective as interruption insofar as the reader is realigned in the process with Levinas's perspective. This effect is clearest perhaps in Levinas's ironic rendition of Heidegger in Heidegger, Gagarin, and Us. We must urgently defend against the century's technology. Man will lose his identity and become a cog in a vast machine. No one will exist for himself. There's some truth in this declamation, Levinas continues, only to further denounce this position later in the essay as attributable to the pagan recesses of our Western souls. That Levinas could not fully master his own irony is evidenced by some of the interpretive disagreements which have surrounded, for example, his position on Zionism. Nonetheless, it seems clear that he did aim to master it, that he depended on the clarity of an idea to shine through language, and was indeed often suspicious of indeterminacy, even as he insisted on an ethics founded on the opacity of the other. Another irony. Of course, Levinas's own passion for a certain literary text is well known. He refers often to the brothers Karamazov in his philosophical writings and found much to admire in Proust. The recently published Carnet de Captivité, his journal from his time in the Nazi lager during the war, attests to this passion. Not only does he quote literary texts extensively, there's also evidence among these that he was taking notes for at least 2 novels. At the same time, however, his own post-war project to find in the Talmud corroboration for his view that the ancient Jewish texts supported his vision of ethics requires him to insist on the text's underlying philosophical meaning. The Talmud harbors philosophical arguments, he suggests, but hides them in apologues and adages. The reader must, quote, retrieve the initial the initial design of its force, even when it is enveloped and made palatable by thoughts that want only to be pious. It's not surprising, perhaps, that Derrida would be sensitive to the conception of textuality evinced in Levinas's work. In Avowing, delivered at the 1998 colloque, and written in close proximity to Literature and Secret, the text with which I began, Derrida quotes one of Levinas's Talmudic readings, given in 1963, also at the colloque on the tractate Yoma. The respect for the stranger and the sanctification of the name of the eternal form a strange equivalence. All the rest is a dead letter. All the rest is literature. The image of God is better honored in the rite given to the stranger than in symbols. Universalism burst the letter apart, for it lay explosive within the letter. He does not quote this passage, however, in order to discuss the role of literature in Levinas's text, but rather to argue that Levinas saw the connection between Jewish universalism and respect for the other. He quotes it in the service of suggesting that there is a germ in Levinas's philosophy for understanding the very resistance to community inscription that Derrida felt so profoundly, particularly in Algeria in the 1940s. He quotes it in the service of counseling for a kind of vigilance against all the risks of a living together, this is a quote, of the Jews, be they of a symbiotic type, naturalized, birth, blood, soil, nation, or conventional state, juridical in the modern sense, a certain communitarianism, a certain Zionism, a certain nationalism, and all that can follow as to the motifs of filiation through blood, appropriation of the place, and the motif of election. That such a sentiment was far from Levinas's own concerns, Levinas, who had devoted much of his energy in the post-war period toward cultivating Jewish communitarianism, lauding the return by Jewish youth to studying Judaism's great books, this does not seem to trouble Derrida, for the point of Derrida's misreading should now be clear. If indeed all the rest is literature, this is the very space that Derrida will choose to inhabit, and in the meantime he will destabilize the very foundation of interpretation upon which Levinas depends, transforming his work thus into literature, in the sense described in Literature and Secret, as a repetition that displaces and destabilizes the covenantal context. It's striking, in fact, that Derrida subtitles the essay Avowing, a lesson, when Derrida himself repeatedly refers to his Talmudic readings as les leçons talmudiques. Derrida thus only omits the Talmudic referent in his own text. He refers to Levinas's own function at the colloque, situates his own work as a repetition, but omits the reference to canonical source. In fact, insofar as there is some kind of scriptural reference, it's clearly that Levinas serves that function. Levinas's own readings occupy the canonical position. In the very passage from which I quoted, Derrida himself seems to be imitating a rabbinic motif. For like the rabbis who often quote only a fragment of a proof text, leaving sometimes the most significant element of it implicit, Derrida too begins his citation of Levinas with an important omission. Levinas's paragraph begins, "To punish children for the faults of their parents is less dreadful than to tolerate impunity when the stranger is injured." The child, according to Levinas's reading of the Talmud passage, can be held accountable for the sin of the parent. Or, as Derrida no doubt reads the line, the child can and will be reinscribed into the tribe to the point of suffering. Derrida sees himself in the context of both the colloque and the Jewish community more broadly as that child who is held accountable against his will, an Isaac figure, if you will. This is a point he emphasizes throughout his presentation at the colloque. He refers to himself repeatedly as the Jewish child and the child of whom I speak. But even as he resists his reinscription into the community on one level, I do want to emphasize that on another level, there's a point upon which Levinas and Derrida agree. Responsibility precedes accountability. If this is the centerpiece of Levinasian ethics, then Derrida is its most adamant supporter. And it is out of his loyalty to this Levinasian principle that he will ultimately call Levinas's communitarian allegiances into question. At the same time, however, Derrida insists on the violence of inscription, on the violence of the very act of election. Derrida's point thus seems to be that without disavowing inscription, one can occupy it differently, by mobilizing the element of betrayal that is already as proper to the covenantal relation as the act of inscription. For Derrida, that is exactly the role of literature, inheritor and traitor, as he writes in Literature and Secret, parodying the very form of covenant or contract as every act of literature does, according to Derrida. Be it understood that literature surely inherits from a holy history within which the Abrahamic moment remains the essential secret, and who would deny that literature remains a religious remainder, a link and a relay for what is sacrosanct in a society without God. But it also denies this history, this appurtenance, this heritage. It denies that affiliation. It betrays it in the double sense of the word. It is unfaithful to it. It breaks with it as the moment of manifesting its truth and of unveiling its secret. To know its own filiation, impossible possibility. This truth rests on the condition of a denial whose possibility was already implied by the binding of Isaac. What I want to emphasize today is the way in which this description of literature is equally a description of Derrida's own relation to Levinas, a betrayal that is equally an act of fidelity, the sign of affiliation that places Levinas as the father and Derrida as the son. With this relation of filiation in mind, we can finally return to consider the way in which Levinas serves as a site of reference for Derrida's various expressions of Jewish identification. In Circonfession, for example, Derrida refers to himself as the last of the Jews, the end of Judaism. There are so few of us and we are so divided, he writes. In other texts, Derrida makes use as well of the notion of the Marrano, for which the act of self-avowal already belies the claim one makes to be a Marrano. This exercise of ironic self-description, declaring oneself le dernier des Juifs, the last and the least of the Jews, is, Derrida discloses in his 2001 Abraham L'Autre, tied up with what he wants to say about literature in its relation to religion and to Judaism, more particularly. Levinas's own distrust of literary modes of expression, there might seem to be a tension here. But the tension's not between Levinas and Derrida, so much as it is within Levinas's own paradigm. It's a tension which Levinas fought to elide, and Derrida seeks to mobilize. What Levinas himself revealed in his treatment of ethical subjectivity is that the I in election is both non-coincident with itself and, in the diachrony of the ethical relation, non-coincident with the other. It is Levinas as well who argues that the covenantal moment in Judaism is axiomatic of this very dynamic. It's out of loyalty to this insight that Derrida insists that betrayal and fidelity always already coincide. But it is this very dynamic that Levinas seems to elide when he speaks from and toward a communitarian position. In telling the story of Levinas's asides at the colloque, Derrida describes his own reaction. How could he, Derrida, welcome the letter according to the spirit of Levinas's comment, that nothing of all these differences, dissociations, or indecisions could damage the complicity of a certain living together that had decided for us well before us? I name thus the supposed friendship, the affinity, the complicity, if not the shareable solidarity of Jews so different within themselves, so different from themselves, within themselves and at their core, be they assured or not of a stable and decidable belonging to Judaism. How could Levinas, moreover, have insisted on the symmetry between the election of ethics and Judaism? How could he have used it to consolidate the communitarian being together of Jews, of Jewish intellectuals? How could he have defended Zionism, Jewish nationalism, the defensive postures that close ranks against those outside of the fold? When Derrida speaks of himself as the last of the Jews, he insists on the resonance that the very structure of election must have on identity. By destabilizing the irony of Levinas's own rhetoric, by enacting a betrayal that is already at the heart of Levinas's own thought, he asks for pardon for not meaning to say. Thank you.
Choice is an abrupt transition, but the formation is more gradual. And I wonder if that warrants further review where a certain degree of non-specificity is entailed in the choice available. The transition to choice is not perfectly crystalline, but is say, a work in progress. So, a cure versus just a good idea for healthy living.
So, are you suggesting that it would be worthwhile temporalizing the notion of choice itself?
Right.
Drawing it out?
Yeah.
Perhaps so. I think that I think Auerbach's response might be that choices should be viewed as pluralized over time, not temporalized, that one makes a choice at the moment.
A piecemeal choice developing.
That could be. It's a very different idea from the one that he's working on, which is a kind of choice that etches your character whether or not you know it, as you develop and unfold in time and fulfill it in some sense or other, or betray it. Yeah.
Please. Yes.
Sort of question, comment. I'm very interested in this traduttore, traditore, the translator, the betrayer, which is also the root of tradition. So I want to try to weave the opinions and suggest some comparative dimensions. First to Dante and Auerbach, as we talked already, I was thinking about Mandelstam, and see curious parallelisms in the idea of philology as philology for the world, not only for the word, but also interesting. For Mandelstam, Dante becomes a site of world culture, and it also is a site of his strange return to Judaism. I'm also interested in the idea that perhaps Derrida is also not getting a joke to some extent, that Levinas is not only proposing irony, he's building communities through a joke. And I also want to ask the question, what is literature? In Levinas' formulation, the rest is literature. I read that Levinas was interested in Mallarmé and Dostoevsky. I'm not sure how we can reconcile the two. I see in Levinas' conceptions a lot of struggle actually between Mallarmé and Dostoevsky. And it's in Dostoevsky, and in my view, a certain kind of misreading or blindness to this sort of, forgive the shortcut, very reactionary Christianity and xenophobia in Dostoevsky, that he builds his ethical, anti-literary, sometimes spirit, and then the rest is literature in Mallarméan sense, for my second favorite writer, then Derrida is not getting how ambivalent is literature in Levinas. So I just wanted to throw this.
Can I respond? I mean, I think I struggle with the idea that maybe there is a less stable irony in Levinas, and of course that's a possibility. My problem with it is that, and in the first book I wrote, I tried to bring out the sense in which you could read Levinas in both senses. It's this other book that I'm writing that's on the Renaissance of Judaism in post-war Paris, in which I encounter a personality whose rigidities just seem to constantly repeat themselves. And so it may be that I am too caught up in the sort of biography of him that is very rigid in his understanding of Judaism and very quick to critique those that he sees on the outside, including Jean Leibovitch, who he constantly chastises for not learning the square letters. But I do see this fundamental distinction between the two. And then I think that what happened with Levinas, to be honest, I think, is that there was a different Levinas before and in some sense during the war. A Levinas that was influenced by his relationship with Blanchot, a Levinas that was leaning towards a kind of more cosmopolitan existence. And not that, of course, he wanted to abandon that insofar as he was a philosopher, but that he felt that he had an obligation, a fundamental historical obligation in the post-war era, to live out a certain sense of speaking to what Judaism could offer as a critique of a kind of, what he calls Western philosophy. And I think that out of that commitment, there develops this real tension in his work.
If I could just respond to your question, thanks. Very quickly, I don't know the Mandelstam, and I'd like to read it and see how Dante could be made into a wandering Jew. I think that's amazing. The question of philology and textuality is complicated because, on the one hand, I don't think that Auerbach would say that the actors that he's looking at are primarily looking at the world in a philological way. He's the one who's the philologist. They're just doing. But what they share, what they share is a certain sense of the historical and maybe an elusive sense of meaning. And so that certainly is the overlap. But I believe that one has to distinguish between what he thinks philology does, which is actually much wider than simply a reading of text, although it works through text, but it arrives at something else, which is structures of meaning, time, embeddedness in the world, and so on. And he gets that probably from Vico more than anywhere. He does align himself with the post-Eloist, post-Yavist authors of the Bible, which becomes for him increasingly historicized, partly because, interestingly, it's the work of philologists and who have a similar sense. But I think that there is still either a distinction to be made or a broadening of philology in order to get the two, textuality and philology, the word in the world to match. And reducing one to one side or the other would be difficult.
I think there's Jay and Yitzhak and Jonathan. Maybe we can actually pose a series of questions since we knew that lunch coming.
In a sense, this is sort of following up on Stephan's point, attention to the irony of Levinas, which is that, sorry, you're talking about this Derrida placing himself as the son in relationship to the father, and this aside is this living together. But you don't pose that, or Derrida doesn't pose it, that what if it's the father speaking to the son? Or perhaps Derrida's anger that it isn't the father speaking to the son. And therefore that whole father-son relationship is sort of left out in any discussion of the aside by Levinas.
Why don't we just collect a bunch of questions, because I think there's wonderful panels.
It's a question for both speakers, and I want to thank you for a great host. In 1942, Ernst Cassirer was invited to give a talk at the Jewish community in New Haven, and the talk was about the essence of Judaism. We have the talk right now at the Bank Library, and I don't remember the title, but at the talk he actually explained what is the essence of Judaism. So for Cassirer in 1942, the essence of Judaism was fighting against Nazism. Now, you look at that, I admire much of Cassirer's work, but as a kind of serious historical characterization, it's nonsense, it's not serious. We thought why he made a fool of himself because he knew virtually nothing. He had very little about the Jewish text. And what I'm asking myself is, when we're looking at so the point is when you are less knowledgeable about certain texts, that you are more likely to make essentialist claims. Now, when you look at Levinas, for example, when he's saying the essence is, what is important is respect for the stranger, and the rest is a dead letter. It corresponds with a certain rabbinic saying about either saying more, just most importantly respect for your friend, but otherwise good. And there is a clear essentialism, right? Based on, what does it mean that the rest is a dead letter? There's no most of the rest. And that letter is, again, a kind of internalization of Christian perception. Similarly, when we look at Auerbach, when Auerbach is speaking, clear, as far as I can see, I don't know him well, so what part of me is this, but the text that you quoted seems to make the point that he's identified in Judaism with the Old Testament. It is as if the Old Testament is keep on going in Europe, etc. And, again, that's not serious. You cannot identify, historically, that's not what Judaism could be in any way be conceived in terms of as a historical phenomenon. So and of course, it's a Christian perception of associated Judaism with the Bible. So, what can we make? How can we make sense of these kind of cases when we have an essentialism based on very partial acquaintance?
Should we let you both respond to those two questions? Should I take some more? Because I think there's.
I think my question at least two.
Okay, so Jonathan and then Shai.
This is a question to Sarah and to Jay Geller. Asking either or both of you, what, if anything, you make of the fact that Derrida is developing his articulation of a distance from Jewish communitarianism at the same time, roughly, that he is articulating a rapprochement between the human and the animal. And I'm thinking particularly of the striking phrase in this animal that therefore I am, the condition of être serré, being squished together in my translation, which is very reminiscent of a nostalgia for the lost Jewish contentious communal sensibility and certain other rhetorics.
So maybe Shai, and then we'll give the speaker some time to comment.
So first to Sarah, two different sort of questions. First to Sarah, perhaps Derrida's irony is not as unstable as you would present it. because at the background there are references, clear references to two other sources. First, of course, to Kierkegaard and his whole. He actually create an encounter between Levinas and Kierkegaard's treatment of the binding of Isaac and the question of faith there, and what kind of faith is Kierkegaard seeing in that story. And the other one is, to me, as I was reading your book also, a very clear reference to Claude Lanzmann and to the final scene of Shoah. To call someone, to say of oneself that I thought I was the last Jew, clearly reference the very final sentence of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, when I don't know if you remember that, but one of the Jewish members of the underground at the Warsaw Ghetto is coming out of the sewer and he's walking through the ghetto, and he says, and I was looking at after the German wiped out the ghetto, and he's saying, I was certain that I was the last Jew. And it's a chilling moment, one of the most chilling moments in the whole movie, but also, you cannot say I'm the last Jew in French 15 years after Lanzmann's movie, and not, and don't
have... Very common trope, Shai. I mean, it could be from Lanzmann, but it could be from lots of other places. Could be from Andrei Schwarz-Barth's book. Right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, as I was saying that, I was thinking about the book as well.
That's why these discussions are productive.
So perhaps I'm wrong, but for...
I think Jim and Sarah probably have lots of...
And then one for Jim, the notion of Dargestell, which, and of Auerbach himself. After all, philology traces representation to the word, and tracing creation to the word is a very Christian act rather than Jewish act. So, in what sense is Auerbach's own? No?
Well, first of all, he, as I said, his definition of philology is from Vico, and not in a Christian sense, but rather he thinks of representation as involving perception of the world, the construction of the world, attitudes and ethics as well. So it's not just simply. I mean, he makes it very, very clear. He's not interested. Most of the time, he thinks he's doing something like social history or history, and not criticism or philology. So I don't think that's, and I don't think that the Christians own the copyright.
No.
Either of those. Either of those meanings.
Let me try to respond to all of these at once and a certain extent. I mean, I guess what I want to say is that first, Shai, the idea that the irony is not as unstable as maybe Derrida thinks it is. I totally agree, and in fact, I guess one of the things I want to emphasize, and I only sort of got to in the paper, is that this is an act of fidelity as well, the fidelity to Levinas, and that this is the way in which Derrida shows his fidelity. And that I think it's a kind of performance of that at the colloque. I mean, he did show up there, and this is also a response to Jonathan. He did show up there, and he did give this talk, and it is a fairly respectful talk. He says in that essay about what it means to live together that it's not like he's actually calling into question the idea that we find ourselves in communities, but only that there's a certain mode of inhabiting them. And in some sense, that mode of inhabiting them for him has to involve these sort of procedures of critique. And I think this deracination is essentially the way in which he employs his own relationship. I mean, there is a lovely point in Sam Moyne's review for the Jewish Review of Books. The last line, he says something like, what Derrida had to show was that there was no one who could keep him out. Right? So it's the other side, and in a sense, it's not only that he's insisting on his desire to be on the outside, but that also he's insisting that nobody can actually keep him out as well.
Can I come back to Yitzhak's point? I take your point that I don't that there is something misrepresent. There's that kind of an exaggeration of sorts, of emphasis on the Old Testament as the document to which we return, and that structures the identity of Judaism. But it has historical reasons as well. At this time, 42, when he's writing it, the Old Testament was being banned in Germany for being a Jewish misrepresentation of reality, for just being Jewish. And especially the Abraham and Isaac scene in particular was being called into question. So when he picks it out, it's as much for the fact that he's talking about the Jewish Old Testament and he keeps repeating the word, but also for the fact that it's politically, ideologically charged at this moment. And he's trying to put in the face of his readers, especially German readers, the fact that it's still, he's reinserting it into the discussion in a way that goes against these prohibitions. So I think it means a lot more than it seems to.
I want to press a little bit on the relationship between community and irony. Certainly in the deconstructionist fascination with unstable irony, I think of Demon in particular, Kevin Newmark's recent book, there is a hostility to the notion that stable irony provides any sort of ground upon which one can build a community. And figures like Kierkegaard or Schlegel or others who represent unstable irony, an irony that is constantly undermining itself, is somehow better, truer, higher, deeper, whatever the kind of background. So I want to explore the relationship between building community on the one hand, stable irony, and the Jewish tradition. Whether you see any sort of linkage, in a way it comes back to the Auerbach version of the Old Testament, whether that may be a misrepresentation of Jewish tradition, as also a place in which various layers exist and is a kind of basic ironic distance, but one which has a certain stability. It's not utterly meaningless. And I wonder how you would link those.
I guess what I would argue is that there is a sense in which there's certainly a kind of a mode of community building, I think, and this is something I feel like you see in the certain traditions of the community based on differences that would actually prize difference as a sort of site of community building. And I think that what's troubling about Levinas is that, and I think this is what Derrida is trying to point out in the essay, Literature and Secret, in some sense, is that Levinas, in fact, isn't comfortable enough, I think, with the foundations of Jewishness that he's trying to build, that he can actually depend on that mode of interpretation. And his Talmudic readings are kind of the perfect place where you see that, where he's over-signifying meaning, he's over-signifying stability, and in fact, it seems to suggest a kind of anxiety about how unstable this Jewish Renaissance, in fact, was.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.